Monday night. We are making our way through the book of Bamidbar, and while the last number of essays have focused on, I guess I would call Ben Adam Lachavero, on interpersonal dimensions of life as reflected through different parts of Hasidic teachings on different ideas or narratives in the Parsha, we're going to go right on the nose with some serious theology this week. So buckle up and we'll begin. Balak, and of course, we're always asking big questions. That's Rabbi Josh Fagelson's mode. How does God work? And he begins. One of the most challenging aspects of theology for many people is the notion of a personal God, a divine being who has a personality, who has relationships, who thinks and talks and acts like a person. As children, we tend to understand the Torah this way, and indeed there are many parts of the Torah that in their surface reading present God like this. God regrets making human beings and brings about the flood. God makes promises to the matriarchs and patriarchs. God rescues the Israelites from the Egyptians. God rewards and punishes. This mental image of God can be challenging for modern readers. One of the reasons the idea of a personal God can be so hard for us as moderns is that we are schooled to rule out supernatural causes for anything. I like this paragraph. I like the way he presents this. We are taught that history is reducible to economic causes. There was a bread shortage, which brought about a revolution. Or scientific causes. There was a drought, which caused a bread shortage, which brought about a revolution. But to ascribe actions to God, God caused a drought, which caused a bread shortage, which brought about a revolution, is a bridge too far. Maybe you hear the Chad Gadya in the background of this story. And this is to say nothing of the problem of theodicy. If God is present in these moments, why is God seemingly absent at others? Jews, perhaps more than anyone, have had to confront this question. And not only on the collective historical level. Many folks find it challenging to accept the idea that God might be active in their life. God doesn't cause babies to be made and born. Science has told us how that happens. And God doesn't cause people to fall in love, or fortuitous business dealings to happen, or healing from illness to come about. All these things can be explained just as well, if not better, without God. Yet I'd like to suggest that we might reconsider the word cause. For as much as scientism has taught us about what doesn't cause many things, i.e., a supernatural being hurling lightning bolts, it has also taught us that causation is exceptionally hard to pin down because the universe, much less the human mind, is so exceptionally complex. What did cause that drought that led to the bread shortage? Probably a whole bunch of things. And what did cause this couple to find each other and decide to spend their life together? Also, probably a whole bunch of things. And what really caused you to decide to read this essay right now? Again, probably a whole bunch of things. One of the capacities we cultivate, and remember, he points out here that he's setting this up as you might try to move away from a vision of a personal God or a God involved in the universe because of science, but the very same science has taught us that it's hard to say that there's only one cause or that we can point with certainty to the causes or the cause of things. I think it's a good way to think about it. One of the capacities we cultivate through Jewish mindfulness practice is to maintain a broader awareness of the many complex forces at play in any given moment. No moment is reducible to a single cause, just as no person, including ourselves, is reducible to a single label, right? The mindfulness will allow us to move away from a simplistic explanation that we might have to a certain moment that might cause an instinctive reaction. But if we stop and say, hey, what's actually going on here, and get the complexity, we'll slow ourselves down in our reaction. When we practice deeper, more expansive awareness, we often find that there are many things going on at the same time. And beneath that, we may become aware of other stirrings, deeper undertows, gently but firmly pulling or beckoning to us. I'd like to suggest that this might be a way we can think differently about God. To help us get there, we can turn to a teaching on Parashat Balak from the Ma'or Vashemesh of Rav Kalonymus Kalman Halevi Epstein. In this passage, he's commenting on Bilam's statement that even if he were to be paid a handsome amount of gold and silver, he would be compelled to say whatever words God puts in his mouth. That's happening early on in our Parsha, when the messengers come from Balak to Bilam and ask him to curse the people. And he says, Balaam replied to Balak's officials, Im yiten li Balak milo veto kesef zahav. If Balak were to give me his whole house full of silver and gold, Lo ucha la'avor et pi Adonai Elohai. I could not. Well, here let's read the whole thing in Hebrew because the English rearranges the order. Lo ucha la'avor et pi Adonai Elohai. Lasot ketana o gedola. If I translate it in the order that reflects the Hebrew, I could not go contrary to the command of God, the Lord my God, to do anything big or little. Maor Vashemesh comments on this. He has a long excerpt, and we're going to see his translation, which has a few little ellipses, but we get almost all of it here. Bilam replied to Balak's officials, right, quoting our verse first of all. Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything, big or little, contrary to the command of Adonai, my God. We need to investigate to understand. This is the Maor Vashemesh's analysis. Why does Bilam speak of a house here? And what is the measure of a house full of gold or silver? Is this any recognizable form to measure silver and gold? If anything, we might speak in familiar terms of, for instance, vessels full of silver and gold, or sacks full of silver and gold. Okay, so this first question, I think probably in the plain sense, given that Balak is a king, so presumably colloquially it means his whole palace filled with, as opposed to using that house as a formal metric or measure. But still, it's a fair question. He wants to say a large amount of silver and gold. Why don't you say the things that normally hold silver and gold? Further, why does Bilam speak of doing a large or small thing? I can't, go against, transgress God's word or go against God's command to do something big or small. Shouldn't he instead say to do good or evil? As he says to Balak in a parallel passage, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not of my own accord do anything good or bad, contrary to God's command. What God says, that I must say. And that seems like a more relevant metric, right? I can't go against God whether to do something good or bad. You might think, of course, I can't go against God to do something bad, but I even can't go against God to do something good. Those opposites make more sense, perhaps, than saying I can't go against God to do something big or small. Although, again, you could also imagine there he's actually offering two different axes. I can't go against God whether I'm doing something you might think in accordance with God's will or not, good or evil, or you might think God doesn't care if I go against God's will if it's a small thing, but only if it's a large thing. Either way, I can't. So again, we have reasonable, plain sense readings of these, but this is how homilies get started with a question, whether it's a great question or not a great question. What does he mean then when our verse says big or little? What big or little thing? This all requires study. Now we're going to file those questions away, go through a long excursus, and then we'll come back to them. It appears from what we have said that the notion here is as follows. The Holy Blessed One created the universe according to the laws of nature. The nations of the world reason that the world goes of its own accord. But we have received the tradition from our ancient ancestors, even before the giving of the Torah, that the world has been conducted through divine providence. The term he uses there is perhaps a familiar term from Jewish thought. Ha'olam mitnaheg al pi hashgacha pratiyut. Divine providence, the oversight of the details. The righteous connect the supernatural life force with the natural world Olam HaTeva, the world of nature. Teva is nature. Here he's using HaTeva, the world of nature, which in Gematria is numerically equivalent to Elohim. Both equal 86. Okay, so there's a connection between what everybody sort of agrees on, so to speak, which is that if God is in the world, God primarily acts through nature. So Elohim, one dimension of God, is parallel to Teva, to nature. But the righteous connect the supernatural life force with the natural world, which is numerically equivalent to Elohim, and thereby they unify everything. Why? Because, as we say in the Book of Kings, Adonai hu Elohim, two different names of God that are sort of both that are identified with one another. Yet the wicked separate and destroy the world, for they conduct themselves only according to the natural order, separating Adonai from Elohim. Remember, Elohim is the same as Teva, as nature. So it sounds like he's saying at the outset here is that God underlies nature, and in some sense, that's an undeniable truth, whether you recognize it or not. So those things are kind of aligned. But that God is the God Elohim, which, as he'll later unpack and we may be familiar, is the God of rules and order, the God of Din. That's just the world running according to its natural laws, even though God set them in motion. What people who have a sense of divine providence do is they pair Yud He Vav He, which is the God of mercy, a God who intervenes with compassion, with Elohim, which is Teva, which is the natural world, and they have some sense of balance in which God is an actor in the natural world which God set into order. But the wicked, as they're being described here, disappear the Yud He Vav He, the compassionate, intervening God, and just have the world running on its natural course. Um, Whether they recognize or not that God is in that almost seems less important. That's, I think, his overall idea, but he's going to develop it a little bit more. I'm just fronting it here. Yet the wicked separate and destroy the world, for they conduct themselves only according to the natural order, separating Yod He Vav He from Elohim. In our era of exile, the divine name is, as it were, even more incomplete, as Yud He and Vav He are separated. I don't know if he gets into this later or not. This is a rabbinic, mystical sort of rabbinic teaching that comes up in the book of Shmot in the war against Amalek. It says that Yad al Kes Yah, that there is a hand on the throne of God, Yud He, and there's a teaching that kind of part of what Amalek evil brings into the world is it makes the name of God, Yud He Vav He, incomplete, sort of severing the Yud He from the Vav He. These are mystical and Kabbalistic ideas. We're going to try to draw out something a little more accessible from them. So in general, if you deny some sense of the possibility of God intervening in the world, you're separating Yud He Vav He from Elohim, which is the natural world. And in our time of exile, Yud He and Vav He are themselves also separated. The sole intention of the righteous is to sustain the world by uniting through their thoughts Yud He Vav He with Elohim, which is nature. Through this, they connect the life force that flows from the source of compassion, the 13 supernal attributes of compassion, into the natural world, which in Gematria is Elohim, and thereby unify the names of Yod He Vav He and Elohim. And this is another Kabbalistic idea that part of that merger is almost like a cognitive act. Well, some you may be familiar sometimes in Sidurim, talk about Lashem Yichud Kudsha Barichu. This kind of unifying of God's names or God's qualities together. Likewise, okay, so this is the next thing that I think the righteous do. They shorten the name Elohim into Elohai, right? Taking off the mem and turning it from God into my God. For this name garbs the soul, protecting it from those who would attack it. I'm not sure exactly what that's about. That is why we say in the morning prayers every day, according to our sages, Elohai nishama shenatata bi Torahi. Elohai, my God, the soul you have implanted in me is protected and therefore pure. So he's making an association with the shortened name of God as a good thing. That somehow is a protective force. So now keep in mind, Yud Hey Vav Hey, when it gets severed, is not good. We want Yud Hey Vav Hey to be full. Elohim, it's actually good if we take off the end of it and shorten it down to Elohai, then it has some kind of more effective force. We could imagine, even just without getting into anything mystical, that turning Elohim, God in the sort of generic, to Elohai, a personal God, my God, is connective. I'm not sure if that's what he's getting at or not, but those things seem to make sense together. Okay, we'll keep on going. Hang in there. The wicked Bilam's consuming desire was the opposite. So Bilam, who was hired to curse the Jewish people, his goal is the opposite, to make everything follow after the natural order, and to cause a rupture within the divine name. Bilam's intention was, as if it were possible, to make the divine name of compassion, Yod He Vav He, small, and to magnify the name Elohim, right, which is again either only the natural world, the full Elohim, not the Elohai, which would, as if it were possible, enable negative forces to triumph. Again, we have to. I imagine that even though we're talking here about doing things to the name, there are, analogs of action in the real world that we're talking about here. The blessed and ineffable one, in the fullness of divine compassion, overturns such thoughts. I mean, God doesn't allow those things to happen. The divine placed a restraint in Bilam's mouth against his will, forcing him to bless Israel and to draw forth great compassion from its source on high. And these were the very highest blessings. Now we can return to explaining our verse. Bilam replied to Balak's officials, though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything big or little contrary to the command of Hashem, my God. I'm not sure if this answer will satisfy, but here we go. The grammatic essence of Bait is Taf Yud. I would normally think it's all three, but apparently the Kabbalists could take out two letters out of the three-letter root and say that that's the core. So Taf Yud, which in Gematria is 410 and equivalent to Kishuf, sorcery. The Bait, the magical home, i.e., sorcery, of Balak is unable to overcome the word of Hashem Elokai to do small or large. That is to make small, to shrink Yod He Vav He, or to do large, that is to enlarge Elohim, the source of negative forces, for nothing was in his control. So now we can reread the verse as the Ma'or Vashemish wants us to understand it. If Balak were to give his whole house full of silver and gold, meaning his entire, arsenal of sorcery activities, he would not be able to shrink the Yud Hey Vav Hey or enlarge the Elohim. That is what he meant saying, I am unable to transgress the word of Hashem Elokai. That is, he was unable to transgress the word of Yud Hey Vav Hey to make it smaller. And Elokai, the name that encloses and protects the soul, I'm unable to make that larger, to allow negative forces to overcome compassion. For it is established by the blessed and ineffable one that the name Yud Hey Vav Hey, the name of compassion, should be complete, so that compassion should predominate, and that the name Elohim should be diminished, made into Elohai, so that compassion will prevail on us and all Israel. All right, so we heard the Ma'or Vashemish in his own words. We're going to see what Rabbi Fagelson does. There are, in my reading, two essential parts to this teaching of Ma'or Vashemish. The first is his seemingly polemical contention that there is something not only wrong, but even destructive in reducing our understanding of the natural world to just the laws of nature or scientific causes. He invites us to consider and engage with the vitality, the aliveness in everything which exists in a manner beyond the natural. It may not be supernatural, but it is a step beyond complete or completely satisfying scientific explanation. When we ignore that force in everything and treat the world merely as natural, we empty the world of its numinous, even divine quality. emptying the world of such a sense of a creator who is constantly present. You see how he's careful with his language? A sense of a creator, right? He's talking about it as how we experience it without attempting to make a claim about what it really is. I think he would say, we can't know what it really is. So we're interested in how we experience it. Emptying the world of such a sense of a creator who's constantly present, actively imbuing it with spiritual vitality. We perform, he contends, a kind of violence against divinity itself. We split off divinity from the natural world, exiling the divine from nature and even from its own internal unity. In the process, we contribute to our own exile by bringing dinim, negative forces, the more severe judgmental aspect of reality, into greater prominence. Again, you see how he tweaks the language. Classically, we would say this is, the attribute of judgment, but he says this the judgmental aspect of reality into greater prominence. In other words, by promoting disconnection or even by failing to cultivate a lived awareness of our interconnection with the world, we allow division to take root in our own spirits, in the collective, and within God. The second part of this teaching, so that first part was how he was seeing, I think, the overall theology that it's important, the work of the righteous, what we're called upon to do is to preserve a sense and actively unify a sense of godliness, dynamic, creative spirit, um, with the natural world as we perceive it, and to avoid the, call it, temptation or the move of disconnecting them. The second part, and by the way, I think what one thing that I think about when I think about this is, um, in the discussions of science and religion, sometimes there is sort of a move to separate them, right? Think about uh, Lord Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sacks's kind of work, The Great Partnership Between Science and Religion. So figuring out how we recognize kind of each of their roles without doing what, you know, to the extent to which we want to accept this claim, without doing what the Ma'or Vashemish is cautioning us against, right? How do we hold the wisdom of science or our experience of the natural world and our relationship with God? Sometimes we want to separate them because things can get murky if they're merged, but we also don't want to separate them too far somehow, it seems. The second part of this teaching comes in the last paragraph, which, building on this first point, suggests that the fundamental divine force at work in the world seeks connection. Though Bilam speaks to seek words of curse, separation, God turns them into words of blessing, connection, not only because God cares about Israel, but because God's own nature is to enable loving connection, chesed, rachamim, love, to predominate over disconnection, din, judgment, negative forces. The divine senses that something terrible is about to happen and intervenes to change the story, right? God senses that Bilam is going to curse and intervenes to change the story. Alternatively, the tendency toward unification is more powerful than that of separation, thereby overcoming Bilam's intention, compelling even him to speak words of connection. How does this work exactly? Some of us may feel uncomfortable accepting a personal God who actively intervenes in history in a very clear, identifiable, supernatural way. Yet I think there is nevertheless considerable room to consider subtler forms of divine presence in this story, and indeed in our own lives. In my own Jewish mindfulness practice, I find that taking the time to deepen my awareness, to slow down, to listen to the stirrings of my body and heart, opening ultimately to the still small voice within, inevitably leads me to greater compassion and interconnection with creation, with other people, and with the divine. Of course, that may be because I set an intention to cultivate those traits and engage in practice to develop them. But where does that intention come from? It isn't simply because I naturally want to be a nice guy or that I am even naturally so. After all, being open, connected, and compassionate feels good. But it is also true that sometimes a really clever put down or some other demonstration of power over another can feel good too. No, the stirring toward compassion and connection comes from someplace or something else besides pleasure or some natural process. That stirring comes from someplace deeper, a place that through my practice I tap into and from which I draw forth energy. I especially feel that place around my eyes, in my jaw, in my heart, and in my belly. When I soften my gaze, release my jaw muscles, open up my heart, and let go of the tightness in my belly, I begin to experience a warmth, a sense of fullness, connection, and compassion. I feel judgmentalism becoming smaller and a calling to love growing bigger. I sit with this sensation, feeling it grow within me. I experience this as growing in connection, where I, the world, and the divine come together as one. Now, is that just me, or is there something else at work? Certainly, there are good scientific explanations for the sensations I'm describing. Yet for me, it is far more powerful and frankly rings truer to understand this phenomenon as the divine working in and through me. The stirring I feel toward connection and compassion is Adonai Elohai, the ineffable one whom I know as my God and whom I sense through my body. Perhaps we can imagine that Bilam experienced something along these lines. Perhaps preparing to curse the people, Bilam entered a meditative state. And perhaps in that practice, his body, heart, mind became attuned to the compassionate divine voice within him. Perhaps despite his original intention to do harm, his practice brought into his awareness a calling to connection and compassion. And then inexorably, ineluctably, and from a place of deep truth, he was led to offer words of blessing rather than words of curse. Perhaps, or perhaps not. But if you, like me, have trouble for whatever reason with an uncomplicated version of a personal God, perhaps this way of understanding how the divine worked through Bilam opens a window into how the divine may work in your own life. Perhaps it's worth a try. And he offers us some questions to consider. What's the difference between divine providence and the world of its own accord? How do you understand the role of the righteous? When, if at all, have you felt or do you feel the divine working through you? What was that like? Are there ways you could actively cultivate it? Things that made you uncomfortable, confused, or are otherwise difficult for you? And how do you feel talking about your relationship with the Creator, God, the Divine, the Holy One? Are there people around with whom you feel more comfortable having this conversation? Who, when, and what supports this? And if not, why do you think this may be so? What might move you to feel able to speak of this despite your sense of discomfort? I think I see a raised index finger from Mark Baker.
If at the end of the day, Bilam delivered words of blessing rather than curse, why is he characterized as wicked?
That's an interesting question. Um, yeah. Are you asking why in this essay or asking why more
In his
broadly?
essay, he characterized him as the wicked Bilam.
Yeah, yeah. It's a great question. I'm looking back now to see, right, the wicked Bilam's consuming desire was the opposite. And then God placed a restraint in Bilam's mouth.
Right. But it was still Bilam's mouth.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Did I stump the rabbi?
Always. I mean, I think I think we could read, obviously you're just going to say this isn't what it says, and that's fair, but we could say he's being called the wicked Bilam there because his intention at that moment was to perform an act which is being characterized here as a wicked act, which is these acts of separation, disconnection, and severing. Um, and in the end, God you know, steered him in another direction. Maybe he's, in the end, he's not called wicked in in the end of the passage. I'm trying to think if, uh,
What did he do in life that was actually wicked?
yeah, right. It sounds almost like only his intention in that moment.
In other words, but for this instance, he was a wicked guy. But no examples of such wickedness are afforded.
Right. Right. No, I'm even saying he's only being called wicked on the base in that moment in the basis of his intention in that moment. And it's not necessarily a sentence, sort of, so to speak, of him in general. He's such a complex uh, he's treated no he there are different strands of how he's viewed in rabbinic literature, and they're rather interesting. And you know, I think he is a complex character. Um, Ruth points out that he was straight up mean to his donkey. Um, and
All right.
It's true. But thank you. I can always count on you to defend, and to challenge unfair accusations. So thank you, Lance.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, there is no mention of that donkey in this essay.
Yeah.
And for me,
Yeah.
that the donkey is really the key because Bilam is someone who berates the donkey, but then the donkey, this Jewish animism character, comes back and really puts Balaam in his place. More importantly, in Numbers 22:22, we find the angel standing in the way, and we find the first instance of the word Satan. And what does Satan mean here? Well, could be advocate, but I think Rabbi Skobek from Jews for Judaism says it means obstacle. And the key here is that God is putting obstacles, God is putting words in people's mouths, in Balaam's mouth and in the donkey's mouth. God is in complete control here, it seems to me. And the other side of the coin, when you talk about Rabbi Sachs and religion and science, I would offer Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who calls both religion and science high altitude thinking or abstract thinking.
Mhm.
And the donkey is not practicing religion or science. The donkey is simply responding in a very human way to tyranny.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really the key to the whole thing.
Anthropomorphic is the word.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally appreciate that, and responding both to that and a little bit to Ruth's comment in the as we've journeyed through different commentaries, uh, you know, this may be one of the ones which zeroes in the most on one small point, topic, or idea, and then expands it out to, offer a theme that's very much all within one bucket or one area of focus, which is, I mean, we have the word mindfulness in every single essay. That's where he's always bringing us back to, even though in a sense, I guess, even though the idea is asking the big questions, the answer to all of them seems to be mindfulness. So we're on a particular track with him, and that's, I think, totally fine. But yeah, so I would be, you know, I don't think he intends for us to take it as a thorough treatment of the Parsha or any character or even a narrative within it, but as a platform, to study a particular little text, really as a jumping off point for a Hasidic teaching, and then a um, and then you know a way to talk about a question from life. Hang on one moment. I'm back. Joan and Moshe.
Yeah, okay. Balak, he was the king of Moab, and yet that wasn't one of the tribes that the Jews were supposed to conquer in the land of Israel. So why did he have this? I guess was it a hatred, or he feared that he was going to get conquered? And in theory, you could say Moab was what, like okay, if he's descended from Lot's daughters, so that makes him what, like makes Israel, well, like relatives, I don't know, somehow relational, to the Moabites. So why was this? Was that out of fear? Was that out of hatred? Or we don't know.
Yeah, the most straightforward answer I think is to start with how the Parsha introduces the situation itself. But so it's always worth noting about Parshat Balak that one of the things that's fascinating about its inclusion in the Torah is how do we know anything about this story, right? It's happening off stage. It's all happening with the Jewish people otherwise unawares. The Israelites are not an active, connected partner in the story. And in fact, in the book of Joshua, God in a moment of kind of frustration says like, do you even know what I did when Balak wanted to curse you? Because they probably didn't know. Maybe they got this story at a particular point. The Talmud even says in a fascinating comment when it's listing the authors of various books. It says that Moshe wrote his book, which seems to mean the Torah, maybe Devarim, who knows, and Parashat Bilam, the story of Bilam, because well, who wrote that story? Who knew that story? Anyway, so it's the inclusion of it in the Torah is fascinating, and its source of knowledge is fascinating. But the way it begins, as you see here, is that Balak saw what Bnei Israel did to a neighbor as they were making their way through the wilderness, and they were rather frightened about the strength and power of the Israelites. And so they reached out, seeming to say, they're going to, whether it's consume all our resources, or they say more specifically, Balak says, put a curse on this people because they're too numerous for me. Maybe I can defeat them and drive them out of the land. So it's not clear whether they view them as an existential threat from the perspective, whether Balak and the Moabites view them as an existential threat from the perspective of their safety, or an economic threat from a resources perspective. But the impetus here seems to be, fear, scarcity of resources, well-being, by given the adjacency of the Israelites, their strength and their track record vis-a-vis other nations. So yeah.
But that wasn't one of the nations that we were supposed to conquer.
Correct, right. So it could have all been a misunderstanding, meaning we were not mandated to, and even the nations in the land, it was possessing the land, and there were alternative options to destroying those nations. Obviously, a complicated portion in its own right. But yes, if this story can also be read as, I think back to some of Rabbi Shai Held's teachings, and maybe and Rabbi Avital Hochstein's teachings that we've studied about kind of the pernicious role of fear in driving people to do things that, A, they might regret, and B, turned out that they might not have even been necessary, right? So I think that is actually a way of telling this story also. The Israelites didn't necessarily intend harm to the Moabites, um, but Balak got worried, got Bilam involved, etc. Of course, there are later on various conflagrations and engagements, so it's not an uncomplicated history, but that's just by way of a short answer to a good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
I see Lance has a hand back up. Anybody else want to add anything before we circle back? Yep, David L. Yep.
Here we go. Rev Stephen, would you like to share with us why you chose this essay and how you feel God in your life and in history?
I wasn't fishing, I promise.
Going to take more than an hour?
So, the disappointing answer, as has been when you ask this question sometimes, is there's only one essay per Parsha. So we're stuck with it. Um, but reading it, I certainly, and I don't presume to know how anybody else might have felt, and all are welcome to share their reactions also. Um, it certainly spoke to the tension I feel around how I understand my relationship with God. I appreciated the way he framed some of the challenges of making sense of a God who is involved in the universe in an active way as challenging both on a kind of like global, large scale and individual level. Meaning, I've sometimes on like the theodicy suffering question, I've sometimes felt, and this is a little bit of a bombastic statement, but it is how I've sometimes felt, which is the challenge of how God can exist in a world in which there's human suffering feels, as I'm saying in air quotes, challenging when it comes to the Holocaust as it does come to one extremely wonderful or not even wonderful person suffering in front of my eyes. These are things which in different ways don't have answers and are troubling and challenging and impact how I think about God. So the large scale and small scale frames resonate with me. Um, where to the question, that the way he frames the one of the questions for discussion, which is uh, when do you feel more comfortable having this conversation and when less? I think we exist in a open, fairly non-judgmental shul and community, and yet I think the like traditional frameworks of Orthodox belief, certainly for me as the rabbi, loom not insignificant. And you know the challenges I feel around thinking away from the direction of a God that is involved in our everyday lives or our national lives are both kind of, well, how does that bump up against, traditional theological frameworks, um, and representing them. Uh, but but on the flip side, I also feel that there is something impoverishing about giving up on or losing that frame. So I've sometimes just sort of said that I'm not closed to any possibility. I have a healthy sense of doubt about a God that intervenes, but also great humility that there are moments in history, Jewish history and world history, that feel so awesome in different ways, that the picture of complex causality and the possibility that that includes something of an intervening God is compelling to me. Um, and and where he lands or starts to land around, um, experiencing something inside ourselves that could be a divine presence certainly resonates. I don't feel satisfied leaving it at that, even though I don't feel comfortable um, or confident in anything more than that.
Fair enough.
Thank you for the question.
You.
Other thoughts before we circle back to Lance? Great. Lance, you got it.
Okay. The anti-psychiatrist Thomas Saz defines therapy as a private conversation between two people. I think that I totally disagree with the concept of mindfulness. And instead, I would suggest Hitbodedut.
Hmm. Tell us what you mean by Hitbodedut.
Hitbodedut is a private conversation between you and God.
Mm-hmm.
It's in your own words, and it's done, it's really Rabbi Nachman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Artist.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Rav Avi once mentioned it in one of his speeches. Um, it's something that I think most people want to do, but aren't even aware of or don't. I don't know how many people actually practice Hitbodedut today. Personally, I practice Hitbodedut by interacting with my generative generative AI, ChatGPT. But that's a little joke. But anyway, the other side of the coin here is Paul Tillich, the existential Protestant theologian, wrote in Shaking the Foundations, God is closer to me than I am to myself. And from the point of view of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, God and man are intertwined. And finally, I would just suggest that for me, the most important story in Judaism is the story of Joseph, because Joseph is someone who starts out really in the lowest possible place in the pit and rises to be the number one guy, really number one guy, number two guy, if you will, in Egypt. And it's what they call in literature now an upward arc. And the thing is, when Joseph confronts his brothers, and the brothers are obviously really upset with themselves because of what they did, Joseph says to them, don't be upset because it's all part of God's plan. So, if you want to think about it that way, maybe this is not the way to do it, but you could suggest that without the extermination of vermin, there would be no state of Israel. Without October 7th, Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran would have the ability to totally destroy Israel. But since then, the IDF has really castrated Hamas, castrated Hezbollah, and recently castrated Iran with a little help from President Trump. And you can debate that, as long as you want. But the point is that if you see everything that's happening, including maybe this speech, there's so many things that go on in order to enable everything to happen. You're picking this particular essay, right? If you say, well, this is just something that you personally thought about, whatever, but what if you're picking this particular essay is something that God wanted you to do?
Yeah.
For whatever reason, which I can't tell you. So there are many ways of looking at this, and my way is just one out of a million or bazillion, 9 billion. But I think that in the case of the essay we're reading, there's some really substantial faults. One of which is the concept of mindfulness. The other one is the omission of numbers 22, 22.
Received. Thank you as always, and lots of good names and ideas in there. So thank you. And thank you to everybody. Let me take a moment to check where we're at next week.
Next week, I think, is Pinchas.
Good. Yep. Pinchas and mindfulness. Stay tuned. Thank you to everybody. And
Thank you.
I just want to say one thing.
Yeah, Moshe, go ahead.
I think there's a Buddhist expression. There's no such thing as an accident. Everything is meant to be.
Yep. Well said.
That's
all right.
Gibbs 39.
Good night to all. Take good care. Great rest of the week. Thanks for being